now that I hopefully convinced you that studying psychology is great, of course, but studying attitudes, the attitudes people have towards certain attitude objects is really important, and understanding why they think, feel, and behave the way they do. Let's try to figure out how we can measure what kind of attitude somebody has. And I mean, the most obvious way is to ask people, right? This is in psychology often referred to as explicit measures. So if you want to know whether I like this movie or that movie, what my attitude towards that movie is, you can simply ask me and I'll tell you. So this is basically the oldest approach in psychology in general, social psychology in particular, just asking people, right? So here the idea is like this is the one item self-esteem scale, which basically tries to measure how your attitudes towards yourself is, how much self-esteem you have, and it just asks you, I have high self-esteem, and you have to answer, not very true of me or very true of me. And so those people who are doing it on Qualtrics, via the Qualtrics link that I provided, they will have answered that question. And that often here gives us kind of like a good idea for the global self-esteem people have, okay? So one kind of response to that, or one problem with these one item measures, is that they don't give us a really nuanced feeling for what is going on, right? If you think about your self-esteem, if you think about your attitude towards yourself, there's so many different aspects that you might be like, dislike, kind of have ambivalent feelings about, and so forth. So often we use longer measures. So here's Rosenberg's self-esteem scale. I think it has 10 items, which is also not very long, but it's the most common measure to measure global self-esteem. And you can see it measures more facets, right? And you can think about, if you're trying to understand why, for instance, a person in a certain situation behaves like that it's just a certain aspect of the self-esteem, a certain aspect of my attitude that really influences this. And it's not just like this global evaluation. Maybe it is here in our example, there's like the pride. I feel I do not much have to be proud of. That is exactly the key facet that influences the behavior we want to measure. So longer scales, multiple item scales give us a much better feeling for what we want to know and give us more range of learning from our results than just single ones. But sometimes it's good to have short ones as well. And sometimes there's also the advantage that we measure something in a very short way over the same way for years and years and years, because now we can kind of look at trends over time and we can compare our results between different countries. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about political polarization, and this is an example how most often political polarization is measured. So you're asked about, like here, for instance, in the UK, you have the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, and you ask on a feeling thermometer to indicate how you feel. And so let's say you think, oh, the Labour Party, I give it a 60, and then this is about, let's say, a 30, and the political polarization is basically the difference you feel between your own party and the opposite party. So the bigger the difference here, the more polarization people feel. So here you can see it's a global evaluation of the opposing party and my own party. And so this is relatively simple, but by comparing these, I can see how far these parties are from each other in my own evaluation. And this has been done. Oops, there's the same, not sure why they have the same slide again, maybe to really hammer home that point, but it has been done for years and years and years, right? The same way of measuring we have from the 1980s to 2010, and even a little bit further longer. So now we can look at affective polarization here on the y-axis. Is it actually growing over time? And here you see in the US, yes, indeed, affective polarization is going up, 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 up. So in comparison to the 1980s, where there was relatively little, let's say about 20 difference, now it is about 40. I'm not very good at drawing lines, about maybe 37 or something like that. So you can see that there's a clear trend in the US that people more and more feel polarized about the political spectrum. So they feel either much better about their own party or much worse about the opposing party, or both. But then you can also look at in Britain, right? So in Britain, here you see same it's the same scale, the effective polarization scale. Sorry, I cut that off here. You can't see that on the y-axis. But here you can see that over the years it's falling slightly, right? So it's not true that worldwide polarization is increasing. No, in some countries it is, and in some countries it's not. You can see here, for instance, let me just clear the erase pan. Sorry, that took me a while. Here you see Germany, right? In Germany, it's actually since the 1980s, it's falling. So it is now around 20, and it used to be much higher. You can similar, you can think about Britain under Thatcher, right? This is like when polarization was in the high, and since it's falling. Why is this interesting? In some ways, it's interesting that you shouldn't believe the media, a topic that I like to stress often. In many different areas. You shouldn't trust the media and kind of saying like, oh my God, polarization worldwide it's going worse and worse and worse. What should we do? It's not true. In more countries than not, the polarization is falling. The US, which often kind of like leads our thinking and the way we perceive certain issues, there it is actually growing, but not so in the UK or in other European countries. I think in Sweden it's even steeply falling. The other point is like that helps us to understand that polarization is not due to Facebook, social media, and so forth. In all of these countries, the adaptation of new media, of social media, of Facebook is the same, yet in some countries, polarization is growing, and in other countries not. That helps us to see that one of the media's most beloved narrative about the evil nature of social media is not actually true when you look at the data. So this is another way to kind of use attitudinal measures, explicit attitudinal measures, to measure things about my attitude towards political parties. This is how it's done often in political parties. One thing I just want to kind of highlight is that here we had, and beforehand, right, we had just one measure from very cold to very warm, right? And this is how it's traditionally done, and this is how most people still measure it, because it helps us to compare our data. But there's also this topic of attitudinal ambivalence, right? You can feel, for instance, here you have Logan Paul and KSI, and you can feel, for instance, warmly towards let's feel warmly towards KSI, as one should, but you can also feel kind of coldly. Maybe you have something where it's like, oh, I really love certain aspects of KSI and I dislike certain aspects about KSI. So there is some kind of ambivalence in my attitude, right? We talked about it ourselves. We often have a certain ambivalence when we think about ourselves, but it's also true about other attitude objects here, famous YouTubers. So you can think about this. Why does this matter? We come in the next Yes, in in one of the next chapters, we talk about the link between behavior and attitudes, right? And here's kind of like a little foreshadowing. If you have a stronger attitudinal ambivalence towards, for instance, eating fruit and vegetables 5 a day, then you're less likely to act on your attitudes than if you do not have this balance, this ambivalence, if you do not have these kind of contradicting feelings about it. So less ambivalence, stronger, better predictor of behavior. You're also on the other side, if you have no ambivalence, you're less likely to persuade it by counter attitudinal messages, right? Think about, let's say I'm in a state of deep depression. I feel only negative things about myself. I can't think of anything positive that is there. I have a deeply negative attitude towards myself. And now you as a therapist trying to convince me that, hey, actually, Andreas, you're not as bad as you think. If I have a little bit of ambivalence, if there is something positive in me, if I then I'm more likely to kind of listen to that, to be persuaded by that, in contrast to not only having kind of like positive, only negative thoughts, okay? So here you can think about like, okay, people who have a no attitudinal ambivalence might, if in the fight between KSI and Logan Paul, and I'm sorry if you're not familiar with the story of them, at some point these YouTubers decided to box each other. They boxed each other twice, actually. You might, if you don't have any attitudinal ambivalence, you just like KSI, then you might support him in his fight against Logan. But then if you have some attitudinal ambivalence, ambivalence. You're just like, who cares? It's just YouTubers in a boxing ring. Why should I watch that? So this is why measuring or giving even the chance to express some ambivalence is really important. One last aspect is kind of the principle of correspondence. The correspondence principle here on a side, and we come back to them by Eisen and Fishbein introduced. So if you want to measure some kind of how you predict behavior, then it's important to measure exactly the behavior and the attitude towards behavior that you're interested in. So in the Qualtrics link, right, you were asked to kind of say like, okay, how do you feel? What's your attitude for attending live lectures, right? From extremely good to extremely bad. So this is an attitude towards a specific behavior. If I want to know whether you come to my next lecture, if you will attend the next live lecture, then I need to ask you specifically about that next lecture. Or I might go a little bit more general and say like, how do you feel about attending live lectures in social psychology in general? If I go then further up higher, right? If I, for instance, say like, oh, you know what? How do you feel about attending lectures in general at university? Then the link between the attitude and the behavior becomes much weaker. So this is the correspondence principle, really important. If you want to predict something, if you want to know whether somebody eats this item or that item, is nice or not, will betray you or not, then you need to measure exactly the right attitude and as specific as possible. That's the correspondence principle. We come back when we talk about the link between behavior and attitude we come back to Eisen and Fishbein and their theory as well. Okay, so now I think by now you might feel like, well, okay, this all makes sense if I want to know, like, do you like that pizza or that YouTuber, or maybe even to political affiliations. But there are a lot of stuff that we as social psychologists are interested in that we can't really measure that well by asking people, right? There's many reasons, as you will see next time, and as you will see over the course of the rest of our social psychology and psychology adventure, that often we don't even know what our real attitude is. We kind of have suspicion about it, but we might not really know. There's also sometimes, obviously, political correctness. There's social desirability. So, for instance, if I kind of look at measures of racism, right? People might feel like, I don't like the people from the other race, but I don't want to admit that. I don't even want to admit that to myself in an anonymized survey. So I will just say that I have no problem with them, but I don't behave in line with that, right? So especially researchers who are interested in attitudes towards outgroups, right? Into explaining behavior towards outgroups by in-group members, they said like, oh, we need to develop new measures. We need to have different measures. So here's like covert measures. One is behavior. So I can only say about my own research, I'm really interested in pro-social behavior. I don't trust if I ask you, hey, would you give some money to that person? I don't trust you that if you tell me that this will actually predict your behavior. Rather, I'm interested in if you have money, whether you're willing to donate or share some of that money. So I use behavior a lot to kind of interfere pro-social attitudes, because I feel that especially in such a socially desirable way of like helping others, cooperating with others, we can't really trust what people say about their own behavior. Another one here is like, this is a seating distance, and this is the picture where people often try to interfere the attitude towards outgroups by looking how far or close they sit towards an outgroup member. So you might come in here and there might be a confederate. Let's say you're in a study and we want to know how your attitudes are towards, in this study it's about a member, like a schizophrenic person. So there's a person that I know or just learned that is schizophrenic, and she sits in a cafe all by themselves. How far or close will I sit? And that tells me maybe more about my real attitude towards schizophrenic people than if you ask me, hey, how warmly do you feel towards schizophrenic people? The problem here is, and the criticism of that is, that you kind of mesh attitudes and behavior, right? And they're two different things. And so by equating them, you lose a little bit of nuance, and you lose kind of like the, how should I say that? Well, the necessity to measure any attitudes, okay? So it's an imperfect way, but sometimes more convincing than asking people directly. Another one is physiological responses. I don't want to go into that. I think by now you probably where from biological psychology, from clinical and other kind of like popular science maybe takes on that there's no way that I can use physiological measures to unambiguously identify what you think, feel, or how you will behave, right? So there's no way to, like, lie detection doesn't work. Even if I have you in a brain scanner, I have my likelihood of trying to understand whether you lie or not, whether how you feel about another person, whether when you see that face you have positive or negative evaluations of that, etc. There's no signature physiological measure to that. So there was a lot of hope pinned on that, but I think by now we feel like, okay, we cannot measure, for instance, emotions or attitudes solely on physiological measures. There's no signature of, for instance, a positive evaluation in our brain, in our heartbeat, in our skin conductance, or any like that. So there might be sometimes in a specific context give us an idea, but these ideas are very vague and do not hold up very well to measuring specific attitudes. So physiological measures don't really work that well. So with behavior, with these physiological measures. Then about 25 years ago, there was kind of like started the revolution. Maybe at the time we didn't know yet, but this was like basically dominated for the last 25 years, the way we measure attitudes. And these are implicit measures. You might have heard of at least one of them, the implicit association test, the IAT, developed by Greenwald and Banerjee and Nosek. I think it was published in 1997. One of the most influential measures in psychology. And this is like a reaction time test. We will talk about this in wonderful detail when we talk about prejudice and racism, because I think understanding implicit measures is super important, and it is especially important in the context of discussions about prejudice, of racism, of unconscious bias, and so forth. So I will just kind of mention this here, but we will not dig deeper into that, because I think this deserves more time and a deeper understanding than we can do in this session that it has, or in our attitude session that is also packed with so much more other stuff that we have to get to. So stay tuned and know that we will get to that, but not in the attitude session.